Hello students, welcome to my lecture on digital platforms as part of the Global Classroom course. The goals of this lecture are twofold. First, I wanted you to gain some insights on crowdsourcing. The reason is that crowdsourcing processes are an integral part of platforms, and I think if you start with crowdsourcing, then it makes it easier to understand the organization processes of platforms. The second part is really understanding platforms as new forms of organizing, and not only understanding how it works and what strategies they use, but also examine the consequences for the better and for the worse. And let me start with crowdsourcing. And I want to give you an historical example that's way before the digital age. And we're now going back into 17th and 18th century. And imagine you're the British Empire. And at that times, of course, it was important to have a good fleet and that the fleet could navigate. But the problem was in terms of navigation that the latitude was rather easy to determine, but not the longitude. And this created a series of problems, and especially in 1707, the British lost an entire fleet and 2,000 men because they wrongly determined the longitude. So what did the British Empire do? The Parliament passed the Longitude Act, and they asked the public, does anyone have a solution to determine the longitude? And if so, you're gonna get £20,000. That doesn't sound a lot today, but back then it was millions of pounds, so an awful lot of money. And there were two kind of strategies that were submitted to this contest, to this innovation contest. One strategy was to use the stars and create charts of the stars and then use that to determine the longitude. But you're obviously going to realize that there is a problem because the solution only works at night. And another issue is if there's clouds above the sea, you cannot use the stars for navigation. And a different approach was proposed by a clockmaker, John Harrison, the son of a carpenter. And he used a clock. The idea was compare the local time at Greenwich to the time to which the chronometer would be set to the time on the ship to determine the longitudinal position of the ship. And he created several prototypes because especially at sea, because the humidity and the different changes in Celsius, etc., makes such a clock difficult to work. But overall, his solution worked far better. It's also the solution that made the history. What I particularly like about this story is through this open call to the general public that the Parliament was able to identify sources for new knowledge that would have not been found otherwise, because the professional educated scientists, especially the Astronomos Royal and people at the scientific board, they were convinced that the star map is the better solution, and they proactively resisted that John Harrison would get the money and the award for his piece, despite it working better. This also shows the instances of a not invented here syndrome, that the professional logic of people who work for ages on a certain problem cannot open up to novel ways of how to find the solution to this problem. And this brings us to the definition of crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing is a term that is derived from two words, namely crowd and outsourcing. And the definition is problem solving or task execution through tasking external sources, that's the outsourcing part, identified through broadcast search, that means one-to-all communication. And through this broadcast search, I identify the crowd, which self-select to engage in problem solving or task execution. Let's apply this to the example we heard before. So in the case, it was the British Parliament who had a problem. Does anyone have a solution to determine the longitude? They made an open call, so broadcast search, one-to-all communication. And I mean, of course, at that times, it was harder to reach everyone, but ideally they reached everyone in the empire who has knowledge about this problem, and they identified the solution, John Harris, through this broadcast search. And this is really important. This idea of crowdsourcing rests on mass communication. And of course, until now, one-to-all communication was mostly an instrument of powerful actors such as the government or the broadcast media. Here, the internet and the Web 2.0 changed something because recipients could also be more active and contribute more actively, and it was easier to manage their contribution and get them. So technology certainly makes a difference here. And on the other hand, crowdsourcing is a continuation of a trend we had in the 90s and 2000s, namely that companies focus on their core competencies and they thought about ways where could we source externally to keep and maintain our organization more efficient. And crowdsourcing rests on a communication chain, which is a necessary condition that crowdsourcing is successful. And we have an organization and we have a crowd. It's basically a question-answer process. So again, the parliament saying, hey, we have a problem, we're going to broadcast the problem and try to reach the crowd. With the problem that we have, the crowd needs to attend the problem. It needs to comprehend the problem. So is the problem understandable? And they need to resonate and respond. And then they answer, they produce a solution. They need to deliver a solution. And then again, the organization needs to process the solution, also understand it and implement it. And as I mentioned before, in the processing and implement part, political dynamics and not invented here syndrome play a role. And what we have now, because of the digital age, there are platforms or intermediaries that focus on collecting calls from organization and distributing them to the crowd. And I'm going to bring you another example shortly, but even in your daily life, you're going to use crowdsourcing. Imagine your cat is sick and there are cat forums on the web. And again, it's the same logic. You say, hey, my cat is sick. It has following things happening with the cat. Then you post it on the forum. Other cat fans attend to it. They try to comprehend it and resonate to it. They produce a solution, say, my cat had a similar thing, I think you should do this and this. And then they deliver it and post it online. And then you have the problem that you might have 3 or 4 different solutions. You need to process it. You implement the solution and hopefully your cat is well again. The same applies for travel tips that you ask for in social media. So crowdsourcing processes are happening more often than you think. Of course, it's a different scale of the people that you reach with a call. And I want to go back to the intermediary to give you another example from a digital age. Here's the NASA challenge for forecasting solar particle events. And this platform, Innocentive, is an organization where private companies but also public organizations turn to, and they focus on highly technical innovation problems. And at that times, I think it's more, they had a crowd network of expert problem solvers which had around 380,000 people from over 200 countries. And in the case of the problem that you see here, the solution that the NASA had to forecast these solar events was about 55%. And that's a problem because 55% is not awful a lot. You almost can flip a coin. And they need to use satellites and a lot of technical stuff to figure this out. And they worked for this problem for several years, and they turned with this problem to incentive. They made an open call to their crowd in the form of an innovation contest, a competition, and said who finds a solution gets $30,000. And 579 people attended to the problem. 11 submitted an actual solution, and the winner was a retired telecommunication engineer who found a solution with 85% chance to forecast this event, and only using equipment that you can, no satellites, just equipment you can use from Earth. And again, it's the similar example as with the longitudinal prize. It's this broadcast search enabling you to identify creative expertise which you otherwise would not have found if you just relied on the expert within your organization. That doesn't mean that you should fire your experts you have in the organization, because you need to have people, if you do open innovation and crowdsourcing process, that sort through all the solutions. I just want to emphasize that this is a mechanism of the open call, that you might find solutions that you don't expect it or would have not found otherwise. I would recommend to take a small break. See you back in a few minutes. Digital exchange platforms are a frequently used example for a new form of organizing. What are exchange platforms? Exchange platforms facilitate transaction or the exchange of other valuable goods, information, or opinions between at least two parties. For example, Airbnb connects travelers, so the demand, with hosts who supply flats where you can stay. Uber, for example, connects consumers with taxis. And another example would be the Google Play or the iTunes Store, which is a platform that connects consumers who are in the demand for applications with the supply that is app producers that produce the apps the consumers desire. The novelty of this organizational form becomes apparent in the statement from Kenny and Zisman. It's a provocative statement. If the Industrial Revolution was organized around the factory, so a machine bureaucracy, today's changes are organized around digital platforms. And if you think about the world's most valuable companies, you will realize that many of them draw on platforms as organizational form to create value. So I think there is some merit behind this statement. Let's have a look at a few examples. When I grew up in Austria in the countryside, I remember when I used to drive with my mother or my father to the next city, there were people along the street, hitchhikers, who hold up a sign and told us, hey, can you take us to this place? And hitchhiking is not as frequent anymore. There are many reasons for that. I want to focus on one reason, is because technology made just hitchhiking replaced or allows a different kind of way to travel with low cost around Germany or Europe. I'm talking about BlaBlaCar, and it's basically similar to Airbnb. You go on the website, so you demand you want to travel somewhere, and then you check who's offering a ride So the supply from, let's say, Berlin to Hamburg, and then you ask if you can get a seat and pay for it. And the map I displayed you here, that's certainly before the Corona crisis. That was a 24-hour map showing more or less the network that BlaBlaCar enables for people to traveling around Europe. So it was an interactive video. But this idea, instead of hitchhiking and standing on the street and waiting for someone who responds to our call, we have a platform that matches supply and demand more efficiently and enables low cost traveling. Another example is in traveling. The dominant player for information about traveling was, amongst other companies, Lonely Planet. How does Lonely Planet work? So it's a hierarchical, centralized organization that hires experts to more or less frequently collect the best travel suggestions. So you as a traveler, when you go somewhere, you have an idea of what things should I look at, which restaurants should I visit, and what else is interesting to see in terms of attractions or nature sites. And this is a stark difference to TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor is started off a community and rests on the crowd-based model. So here the idea is that instead of expert-based judgment, it's the crowd itself that rates and reviews the sites more frequently. So on the Lonely Planet it was just once a year, and for TripAdvisor it's a continuous evaluation of all the touristic sites. And through the ideas, because the evaluations we have so many evaluations, and we have also always very recent information, that we can distill the best tourist attractions for the travelers. And TripAdvisor developed to a platform, so it started off as a community, but certainly now it tailors also its services to people who want to offer their tourist sites or their hotel and also other advertising clients. So they have now become a platform. We talked about the example of Airbnb before, but it follows the same logic on how platforms emerged. So in the beginning, before Airbnb, you had the hotel industry where the dominant mode of how you consume space was that you had a travel agent, or you went on a website and then you book a certain room. You consume the room, there's a professional staff behind it, professional hierarchical organization, and organizes everything. And what Airbnb certainly changed is the idea that you could stay at someone else's house was existing before Airbnb, but it was a very small niche. But Airbnb scaled it up through having several mechanisms in place that we can trust each other, so we can stay at someone else's house. Namely, you have the rating mechanism. So after each transaction, there's a rating. So we can weed out market players that don't follow the rules. But Airbnb also uses very traditional mechanisms. So you have verified identification of Airbnb, so you know who's gonna come. And the third mechanism is that Airbnb uses a travel insurance. So if I'm a host and someone comes to my place and there's some damage, Airbnb provides an insurance for the damage that someone else's for a traveler does. I want to explore with you the inner workings of this organizational form in more detail, again by drawing mostly on the example of Airbnb. So we talked about the purpose of exchange platforms, facilitating interaction between the supply and demand side. So the supply, the hosts, and the demand, the travelers. The resources exchange platforms are really about resource orchestration. So it's making an open call. We need to mobilize the hosts. Then we need to sort them, and then we need to evaluate them based on a rating system. And then we have superhosts and normal hosts. And there's difference what hosts do we show when someone looks for a place to stay. Then there's a certain way how they go about control. So the main issue is about how do I ensure as Airbnb when someone looks for a hotel that I have a match and can I book it right away. So there's prediction happens through probabilities. The idea is if we have a large enough network of hosts, we can ensure good match. Then certainly algorithmic governance plays a role. So they use the data traces, they identify unwanted behavior. This is also in relation to the interface design. So what do we see and who do we see and what do we not see when we look at the platform? They always have rules in place. So which rules do you need to follow when you are a host on a platform? Which rules do you need to follow when you're a traveler? The strategy for platforms is always increase network effects, and they use subsidies and incentives for that. So we know on Airbnb, the more travelers you have, the more interesting it is for hosts to be on the platform. The more hosts there are, the more interesting it is for the travelers. The value is higher. And on Airbnb, in terms of subsidies and incentives, for host incentives are, if you're a superhost, you get more shown in comparison if you're not a superhost, because superhost you get if you have a better rating. In terms of subsidies, travelers pay a higher service fee than the hosts, so the hosts are subsidized in the case of Airbnb. Then certainly the strategy is to increase the quality of the interactions. So you want to make sure the trust mechanisms works, that there always a match happens. So what Airbnb does when you sign up for Airbnb as a new host, they want to ensure that you activate the instant booking function, so it's similar to a hotel. And another strategy is once you have a certain consumer and database, and you know what's going on, that you add additional interactions. For example, Airbnb is not only offering a place to stay, but now you can also book experiences in certain cities. And management is different in a sense of management you see as a network, market or community organizing. You can see it in the language that they use. It's very informal, it's encouraging. This does not mean that they issue control or pressure hosts to do what they want, but it's packaged in a different language. And without going into too much detail, this differs from how a regular hotel chain would offer the services. And I just want to point out two examples. For example, a hotel chain like Marriott, if you think resources, they don't orchestrate them, they control them. So they control certain steps of a value chain, they own the hotels. In terms of control, they want to establish a good service and prediction through hierarchical control. They have employees, they know they can deliver a certain service quality. And this is just a different way of organizing in comparison how Airbnb does it. And we already talked about network effects, and you will also read about it in the literature, in the readings by Evans and Schmalensee, also by Van Elstein and colleagues. I just want to show you also this image from an article by Ian Sitin-Lakan in Harvard Business Review, and where they really emphasize that the digital platform with strong network effects surpass traditional product or service businesses. Because for traditional product and service business, gaining additional customers does not continue adding commensurate value after a certain point. But for platform businesses, the argument like Amazon or Facebook, they become more and more valuable as companies use them. And this connecting with one another creates network effects, either within the same site. So the more people are on Facebook, the more interesting is to be part of the network. And in the case of Airbnb, of course, we have the cross-network effects across the supply and demand side. So the more people are hosts, then it's more interesting for the demand, the travelers, and the more travelers there are, the more interesting it is for the host. But I also want to add that it's not only about these network effects that make the economic value and how they achieve it, it's also the reinforced effects from big data. So this idea of making use of data traces to increase efficiency and effectiveness of the platform, to keep the people on the platform, to find mechanisms to further stimulate activity. I also want to note that while we would consider exchange platforms itself as a new forms of organizing, what is interesting though is, and here is an organizational chart that I found somewhere online, and there's not much literature about it because the big firms don't really want that people peek into their inner workings. But what is interesting, that these new forms of organizing itself are organized by rather traditional, hierarchical and divisional organizations where they have a clear division of labor and different functions. So this, just to keep in mind, the platforms and this market organizing, yes, that's novel, but the organizations that run those platforms, they can be rather traditional. They might have certainly new departments. So of course you need community management departments. For instance, in the case of Airbnb and other platforms. But apart from that, how they do their day-to-day work within the organization is rather traditional. Again, I would recommend to take a small break. See you back in a few minutes. In the final section of this class, I really want to talk a little bit about the dark sides of platforms, so the consequences. Because platforms also take from us, they plan things, so we buy them, and they surveil us. And for those who really want to dive deeper into this topic, especially the issue of surveillance, I can recommend the book from Shoshana Zuboff. And I know that in some other courses you're going to read some sections from her book, but I really recommend the full book. And the sentence to advertising is the watching you with your full consent. So this idea that we got used to being surveilled at all time, and her argument is this has grave consequences, and this is not necessarily the way it needs to be. And this issue of surveillance certainly triggers associations to the book George Orwell 1984, where you could argue, yes, that surveillance capabilities are the same, but certainly the system George Orwell had was a centralized state system. So it's a bit different, but I think the analogy still holds. And I want to examine with you some of the dark sides, or give you some examples. For example, on the Amazon Marketplace, there are a lot of dirty dealings because it's so important. So it's not only that Amazon exerts power over the people who want to sell stuff there, such as the traders, it's also between the merchants and the traders that dirty dealings happens. So in this article, which you can read in more detail, but one practice I found particularly interesting is So if I have a competitor who has a similar product than I have, I can do two things. Number one, I go to a fake review site and make sure that this other company gets a fake positive review. Why is this a dirty dealing? Because Amazon tracks fake reviews, and if the company realizes that someone gets a lot of fake positive reviews, they might remove him or her temporarily or ban him temporarily from the marketplace. Another practice is just saying that a product is, or claiming that another one's product is violating safety standards. So I recommend reading this, but this problem that we face here, that Amazon is a very huge marketplace and there are governance issues that are certainly not resolved yet. And staying with Amazon, and in organization theory, we would say Amazon is a market organizer. The problem is Amazon is not only a market organizer, it's also a merchant himself. And there is criticism that Amazon uses all the data available to see which products are going particularly well, and then they launch product within this very category. But they not only launch product in this category, that also place their own products more visible on the marketplace. I think it's fair to criticize Amazon for that, but we also have to see that this practice is not necessarily new, because we also knew from the supermarkets in the physical world like Lidl, Aldi Nord, Rewe, that they have their own, that they are not only market organizer, but also place their own brands in the supermarket and exert pressure on the suppliers. Certainly it's not the same scale, so Amazon is a completely new scale, but I just want to say the idea is not new. And we also see it in other areas. So on Instagram, there are a lot of websites where you can easily buy followers, likes, and views. So for example, you can buy 2,500 followers for $15. Then you probably remember the story from, it's now 4 years or 5 years ago, where Twitter campaign takes aim at fake restaurant reviews on TripAdvisor. It was becoming on the surface of our attention, where there was a completely fake restaurant that was not existing through reviews became the number one in a major city, and so this is just saying, are the crowd-based evaluation systems are they secure enough? And we would say no, because we see these instances that people find loopholes in the governance, and here the campaign calls for if there is no receipt, there should be no review. And even on Uber, and I think, I'm not sure if it's the same case for My Taxi or Taxi Now or Drive Now, or whatever these platforms are called now. But there was a really interesting article by Alex Rosenblatt, and imagine yourself, you put yourself in the shoes of Uber. You always want to give the consumer, as I mentioned before, a good matching experience. So if you open your phone and you want to order a taxi, it looks good when a taxi is close by. But what this article digs into, that some taxis you see on the map are not real. They just should create the perception that a lot of taxis are close to you. But then when you buy it, it's another cab a little bit far away that gets the job, and you cannot control it because maybe the other cab just got an order from a different client, so there's not really a way to control it. And to further dive into these issues, I want to show you some work that students of mine did in a course that I teach in the Masters, ein Lehrforschungsprojekt, How Do Crowd-Based Platforms Operate, leveraging organization theory to inquire into platforms' organizing processes. And based on ethnographies, they also digged into this issue of fake reviews and the problematic practices that emerged that indeed question the legitimacy of the review system, or at least stimulate us to think about, is this really the best systems, or do we need different governance form to regulate this? An example from eBay. So eBay is a platform where you can buy products, or you yourself sell your used stuff. And there's the website watchers.com. What does a watcher mean? So if you put a product on the eBay marketplace, then people, if other people look on your listing, they see how many other people are watching this product. So they showed interest but have not bought it yet. And the idea is certainly if you have more watchers, other people who might be interested are more likely to buy it right away because they fear someone else could take the product. And as you can see here, you can buy watches to a different degree. So for $2 you get 30 watches, and for $55 you can get 200 watches. And what my students did is that they also used the live chat, which you see below on the right side. And it says here, welcome to our site. If you need help, simply reply to this message. We are online and ready to help. So my students went into the chat and had a conversation with them, and they asked them, hey, these watchers, isn't that a problem? And the person from the customer service replied, yes, it is a gray zone for sure, but eBay doesn't do anything because more sales on a listing means more money for eBay. They know this. Almost 90% of all eBay shops use services like ours. And of course, we should be a little caution whether this statement is true, because it's from a gray zone third-party service. But if you think about it, there's some merits behind the argument, especially since we know that platforms do a lot of things to stimulate and engage sales on their platforms. So although they might not officially support such a service, they might not proactively try to ban it and root it out on its platform. But my students also continue to ask questions, but what about fake reviews? And if they also do something in this realm. And then the provider says, no, only views and watches for a better shop ranking or better listing. Reviews are not a gray zone. This is really fake. And I find it somewhat ironic that a fake review provider tries to distinguish itself as a legitimate alternative to something that's really fake, namely buying fake reviews. And these examples should just to stimulate your thinking. If you think about the examples of Instagram, TripAdvisor, now we had eBay, and what's going on the Amazon marketplace, that I think there will be more debates about the governance of these platforms, but in particular since reviews are such an important thing that guiding day-to-day consumer action. And obviously the crowd-based systems have their loopholes and are increasingly used to manipulate us. So this is an issue where we see further debates and changes in the platforms in the future. At least that's my hypothesis. And this brings me to the end of this lecture. I hope you gained an insight about crowdsourcing processes, as well about the new forms of organizing of platforms, and that I could also encourage you to think about the negative consequences and the downsides of platforms, particularly by emphasizing the issue of the review systems. Have a good day, and I wish you a lot of energy for your studies.